Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about my favorite genre of hip hop, one that changed the course of music history and for quite a long time dominated the pop charts and influenced so many other kinds of music that were sort of adjacent to the hip hop from which this style derived. And I'm, of course, talking about G Funk. And before we get into it, remember to like and subscribe. I hate to say that so much, but that's what helps this young channel grow. And eating vegetables is something that this channel will very much do. So let's look at the state of hip hop just before G Funk, because in the mid to late 1980s, hip hop and rap in particular absolutely exploded. It had already been rising in popularity since the early ish 80s. There was, of course, the Sugar Hill Gang at the end of the 70s, and then the genre really started to attract people's attention with things like Run DMC in the early 80s, and their sort of fusion, if you will, collaboration with Aerosmith, who themselves were in the midst of a revitalization campaign, if you will. It helped to bring the genre to attention of demographics outside of the East Coast urban black youths who invented the genre in the 70s. Now, as the genre continued to grow in popularity and mature and diversify in terms of content, something big happened in the West Coast in the late 80s. And people who were early sort of pioneers of the West Coast sound, like the Egyptian Lover, they paved the way for a generation of MCs who would invent a new kind of rap that at the time was called reality rap, but more commonly became known, thanks not to the artists, but to the critics, as gangster rap. Now, this rap's production style didn't vary all that much from what was going on the East Coast. It did a bit, but the thing that really set it apart was its lyrical content. It was more gritty, it was more explicit, it was more about realism. And of course, there were some sort of Hollywood elements in it, but Ice-T lived the lifestyle that he was talking about. And the things he was warning against are the things that he saw happening to his friends, because it was Ice-T who was the first commercially successful and artistically beloved West Coast rapper of this gangster rap, reality rap genre. A few years after Ice's debut, you see NWA. And this was a group of people who were unknown to the wider world, but I think in hindsight, it's fair to say that it was something of a supergroup. You had, of course, Eazy-E, who was himself a hustler who helped bankroll part of the operation. You had Ice Cube, who was the real poet of the bunch. You had MC Ren, quite a poet himself, and someone who always was always leaning towards a spiritual path, which he eventually found. You had DJ Yella, the party animal, and you had Dr. Dre, the producer who created the sound. And again, the sounds of Ice-T's mid to late 80s rap and the first NWA material wasn't all that much of a departure from the dominant East Coast hip hop production style. But it was noticed straight away that compared to any hip hop albums, the first NWA album was produced really well, because Dr. Dre has always had a wonderful sense of music. He grew up listening to things like Parliament Funkadelic, Herbie Hancock, Roy Ayers, sort of jazz fusion, soul, funk, R&B, traditional jazz, all sorts of different interesting genres. He had a knowledge of what we might term white music as well, rock and roll, and it was in fact Ice-T who actually said something very interesting. He said, when you want to groove and get down and relax, you listen to funk and R&B. When you want to get aggressive, you'll listen to heavy metal, hard rock. And the importance of that statement will very much inform the parts of this conversation that we'll have continuing on from here. Now, the dominant rap sound of the 80s was dominated by the sound of drum machines. There were Akai, Roland. I mean, most of them were made in Japan. They were relatively simple to program, not so simple if you wanted to program them interestingly, as Dr. Dre did. But that was the main sound of 1980s hip hop. And of course, the drum loops that you'd create with the drum machines, you would sample various sections of well known funk or pop songs and create a basic track, create the beat, as they say in hip hop. And this sustained the genre very well throughout the 80s. But as the decade came to a close, some producers, most famously Dr. Dre, wanted to do something more with the sound. And there were already hints of Dr. Dre kind of departing from that classic golden age, if you will, hip hop sound by the late 80s. Think of the album "No One Can Do It Better" by the DOC, whose career as an MC was cut short due to a terrible accident. He continued to be a lyricist, produce, and be involved in the music industry. But on that album, we get to hear things that are very different sounding than the hip hop that the world had come to know. And these were the beginnings of G Funk, a musical style, a production style that would reshape hip hop in the 1990s. Now, how do we differentiate G Funk from the production styles in hip hop that came before it? Well, for one, in place of your sort of traditional drum machine, you have the bass guitar becoming as important and in some cases more important to establishing the basic beat than the drum machine. In terms of the percussive sounds, you have a much more diverse array of sounds. The sonic percussive palette has become much more diverse. You start to see some real percussion, you start to see drum machines used in different ways, you see maybe a lot more sounds, whether synthesized or authentic, of a ride cymbal or of a hi hat, and less much of a pronounced sort of snary type of percussive sound. We also see a lot of synthesizers, a lot of lead synths, meaning a synth usually played monophonically, usually meaning one note at a time, creating hooks, creating melody lines, creating riffs. And beneath that, you have synth pads or polyphonic synths really laying down very ethereal, very groovy sounds. Think the kind of thing that the synth player might be vamping on while Roy Ayers does a vibraphone solo, that type of thing. You also have a lot more variation within a single track. Rather than just a steady beat over a repetitive sample, you have a lot of differentiation, multiple samples sort of playing with one another, one melody line here interacting with another harmonic pattern here, a combination of real instruments playing covers of older songs, playing some original material and recorded samples, where before you would really only have a recorded sample. And don't get me wrong, there were people who, before G Funk, were pioneering different ways of having different sounds involved in music. Um, for instance, Gangstar, who came around somewhat before the G Funk era. I need to turn off this sound. Live TV, folks. They, you could argue, had a sound that was fusing hip hop with other styles. And A Tribe Called Quest, an East Coast group, were definitely pioneers of interesting sounds in terms of the beats. But G Funk had a very noticeable sound, and you could say that the lead synth sound very noticeable. Think of the lead synth on Nothing But a G Thing, possibly the most famous G Funk track. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. As NWA were folding, they did their Ends for Life album, which again hinted at Dr. Dre taking production in a different direction. But it all really came together in 1992 with an album that changed music history. And this was The Chronic. It referenced G Funk. It was G Funk. It arguably, at least so far as the public was aware, it invented G Funk. And it had so many of the superstars of that genre on it, whether in terms of producers or in terms of the MCs most closely associated with it in the 90s. Snoop Dogg was obviously, as Snoop Doggy Dogg, introduced to the world on that album. Warren G, who we'll get to in a minute, was there. Daz Dillinger was there. The whole gang was there. And the album, it passes my test as being one of those albums without a single bad track on it. It really is a cohesive masterpiece, both sonically and lyrically. It has humor, it has serious social commentary, it has fun, it can get obscene at times, but it all just makes sense. when you listen to it. And that production was absolutely fantastic. It stands up to this day, and everyone started to sit up and take notice, because if NWA changed the world by introducing a rawer, more political, grittier style rap that broke into the mainstream. There was other conscious rap before, but NWA took these concepts and packaged them in a way that was appealing, to young kids, teenagers of really all backgrounds. And so if that album sort of broke everything big in terms of the lyricism, the Chronic did the same for the musicality. And this was because of that G Funk sound. And of course, Dr. Dre picked up where he left off when he produced Snoop Doggy Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style. Same vibe, same great production. The lead synths, the great harmonies, the prominent bass guitar, arguably being more prominent than the sound of the drum machines, all of that good stuff. Now, this was primarily, not exclusively, but it was primarily a West Coast sound. And one of my very favorite rappers ever, who I mentioned earlier, Ice Cube, didn't waste all that much time getting into this style. We all know the story that he wanted Dr. Dre to produce his debut album, America's Most Wanted, in 1990. His dispute was with Eazy-E and Jerry Heller, NWA's controversial manager. His dispute wasn't with the other members of the group. But that didn't work out. So he went to New York, and it had a very East Coast sound. But Ice Cube, even in 1991, I would say that his album, which is generally thought of as his masterpiece, Death Certificate from 91, was sort of a transition album where it was one foot in the world of pre G Funk production, one world hinting at what was going on in LA around the production scene. But his next two albums definitely embraced the G Funk sound. Albums like The Predator and Lethal Injection. And we've got to mention some of the great producers from the West Coast that you worked on those albums, who don't necessarily get the credit they deserve. There's Sir Jinx, who was a huge influence on Ice Cube's sound. There was also DJ Pooh, who we would go on to write the screenplay for Friday with. There was QD3, another big influence. And around this time, also someone that we've got to mention, DJ Battlecat, who's did a lot of work with West Coast Cam, one of my favorite MCs of all time, and still does work with West Coast Cam. So again, all of these people vital in creating this West Coast sound as distinct from the West Coast style of rapping. So gangster rap was a lyrical style that came from the West Coast in the mid to late 80s. But G Funk and the albums, the sound influenced by it, that was about sonics, that was about music, that was about the beat. Now, at the same time, also, DJ Quick was becoming a pretty big star. Again, not necessarily given the recognition he deserves, but he was brilliant, and he was increasingly embracing the G Funk sound and became quite a pioneer of it. You could say that in terms of production, his 1995 album Safe and Sound was one of his best, but Rhythmalism from 1998 was also amazing, as were all of his later albums into the early 2000s. And unlike some, I would say that DJ Quick tended to keep the flag of G Funk production flying for quite a lot longer than some. And now we get to the album that, along with The Chronic and Doggy Style, is probably the quintessential G Funk album. And this is, of course, Warren G's 1994 album, Regulate G Funk Era. The name of the genre is in the title, so you can't miss it. And Warren G, I would say, if you had to name one producer who was one of the inventors of G Funk who never really let the sound die, it was him. Now, Warren G's father was a huge jazz guy, and he had lots of jazz records in the house. And so Warren G was growing up listening to people like Herbie Hancock, Coltrane, Miles Davis, all of the greats from that sort of bebop and post-pop era. And that really informed his sense of harmony. It informed what he noticed that he liked in funk music. And all of those characteristics that I mentioned earlier of G-Funk, the chordal harmonies, the really prominent lead synth, the bass guitar being more prominent than the more laid back sound of either real drums or drum machine. And one name that I haven't yet mentioned, who is arguably one of the most important people in the G Funk movement, is Nate Dogg. because unlike a lot of the rap from from the 80s, the G-funk sound had singing. It had the singing of what is called the hook. Some might call it the refrain, and no one did it better, some will get the reference, than Nate Dogg. He was the person that was singing the hooks on all of these great G-funk tracks and albums. He was on The Chronic, on Doggy Style, collaborated really closely with Warren G, and obviously he grew up with Warren G and Snoop Dogg from the Long Beach area. And so they were in a group called 213, long history with them. And Nate Dogg was featured heavily on Regulate G Funk Era. And as I said, so many other bands, Daz Dillinger and the Dog Pound, Nate Dogg was there. He's collaborated with Ice Cube. So many others. So you've got to say that that is another ingredient, another element that made the G Funk sound so prominent. Now, as the early 90s became the mid 90s, everyone was getting in on the G-funk sound. It became the dominant musical idiom in terms of the beats, the production style of hip hop. So you had projects by Ice Cube like West Side Connection that were using it, groups like the Dog Pound and Tupac, who was very rapidly becoming the biggest rapper in the world by the mid 90s. His album All Eyes on Me was definitely one that had a lot of G-funk influence. Now, Tupac's albums they usually were produced by multiple producers, which isn't unusual. Some hip hop albums have one producer, some have several. And so there was Me Against the World in 1995 with quite a bit of G-funk influence, and then All Eyes on Me, his first album for Death Row Records, the label most associated with the G-funk sound. There were a lot of producers embracing that sound. There was DJ Pooh on the album, QD3 on the album, Daz Dillinger produced some stuff, and of course California Love, the anthemic song, was definitely in that G-funk era, and that was, of course, produced by Dr. Dre. Some of the songs on All Eyes on Me are a bit more G-funk than others. Um, for instance, would argue, um, where's side two? I'm just looking at my record check here. That "Run the Streets" is one of the most quintessential G-funk songs, frankly, of that era. But on an album with quite a lot of G-funk, I would say that "Run the Streets" is really emblematic of that G-funk sound. Um, so many others. Thug's Passion, another one on that album. Again, the production super emblematic of that style. DJ Pooh into the late 90s, Bad News Travels Fast. Really a lot of G-Funk stuff on there, especially on the Cam song, You Have No Idea. Now, what happens when a star, and there are other rappers at this time who were definitely using production that was in the G-Funk style. I have to mention that on West Coast Cam's second album, Keep the Peace was produced by Warren G, one of the finest G-Funk tracks absolutely ever. Wonderful song. That album, by the way, Made in America, Cam's second album, that's still on Spotify, though unfortunately his first album, which wasn't as much in the G-Funk style, Never Again, that's been removed from Spotify due to standard legal disputes, but hopefully it will be back. And another mention of some neo G funk that Cam has been involved in, a recent single called Legend in My Section, produced by DJ Battlecat, one of the people who in the 90s was really central to creating that G-Funk sound, as was someone else who I neglected to mention earlier, Cold 187, a really important both MC and producer. And in addition to doing his own material, he did a lot of Eazy-E's post NWA stuff, which gave that very much that G-Funk sound, and perhaps increasing that post NWA rivalry between Easy and Dr. Dre. So where were we? So okay, we're in the mid 90s, mid to late 90s now, and imitation is, of course, as always, the best form of flattery. And by now, everyone, no matter where in the world they're making hip hop, they want to sound like the G Funk sound. It went from being something pretty much exclusively to the West Coast sound, Southern California, and a bit in the Bay Area, to being a global phenomenon. And when that happens, things can sometimes get diluted. And so we see a G-funk sound that hints at some of these sort of musical signatures that I mentioned earlier, that are indelibly associated with the G-funk sound, mixed in with some other influences. And some would say that when Tupac died, or when he allegedly died, I know everyone's got a theory about what happened, that the West Coast sound died, and some people might have agreed. But then Dr. Dre comes back in a big way with the second album proper on his own label, Aftermath, and in 1999 he released Chronic 2001, and he revitalized G-Funk. Now the sound of 2001 is definitely different than the Chronic. Namely, there's a bit less synth and a bit more acoustic instruments. So you've got acoustic piano, you've got acoustic guitar, you've got a real electric guitar as opposed to synthesizer, but it's still played in that gritty, funky, soulful, laid back way. Um, just getting something up here, folks. Will only be a moment. And it's my album, if you're asking. Now, this album, again, it had that combination of real musicians and samples. It had, again, many more, much less synthesizer, although there was some. And one of my favorite songs on that album of all is one called Explosive, and it features Corrupt, who was a huge part of that West Coast sound. It features Nate Dogg, as always, and it sampled one of my absolute favorite songs called Bumpy's Lament. Let me find out when that was done. I think it was the mid 70s. I want to just get the year exact. Mhm. So this was from the original soundtrack to Shaft, which obviously Isaac Hayes did the lead single and theme song for, and it was by Soul Man MANN and the Brothers. Okay, it was early 70s, not mid 70s, 1971. Definitely listen to the original. If you've only heard Dr. Dre's Explosive, you're definitely gonna want to hear the original Bumpy's Lament because it's a great track. And another thing that I think we can think about when we look at Dr. Dre's 2001 is that the diversity of his samples becomes even wider afield. And again, though, he retained the core elements of G-Funk while reinventing it. And this tended in the very early years of the 2000s, tended to go on, but then a few things happened in hip hop. Samples tended to get a lot more expensive, which led people to various novel solutions, including those that Dre pioneered in the early 90s, which is using real musicians, session guys, to cover the style and the songs themselves that you were sampling. But other trends happened, and I would say that post sort of 2001 hip hop can be divided into two production styles. There was the cinematic style and the southern style, and one outlasted the other. Just quickly, other people from the 90s who I have to mention as MCs that were part of that West Coast sound. There was Raz Kass, who was amazing and still is, and Del the Funky Homo Sapien. Say that three times fast. Two great MCs who experimented with a lot of different production styles, but there were definitely elements of G Funk in them, especially on Raz Kass's LA Fabulous. I'm having these Joe Biden moments. We all do. So we're in the early 2000s now on our journey, and there's the Southern sound that becomes really popular, which was a much more in your face drum machine heavy sound. A drum machine that was insistent, that was pounding. And think of people like Ludacris, think of people like Lil Jon, and that became an extremely dominant sound in the early 2000s. Some would say because New York and LA were rivaling so much, the guys in Atlanta and elsewhere were really sort of saying, hey, and Outkast, who had been doing a kind of southern version of G Funk even in the mid 90s, they became huge at the turn of the 20th century. Then there was another style of production that was happening at the same time that I would call the more cinematic style of rap. It was less funky than G-funk, less sort of Brooklyn streets than sort of the 80s style of drum machine heavy and sample heavy, consistent sample heavy hip hop. And this was pioneered by the man then known as Kanye West. And you could hear it on his own stuff, you could hear it on the stuff he produced for Jay-Z. And while the Southern sound had a pretty good run, I would say that between the beginning of the 2000s into maybe 2015, when everything started to get more nebulous, I would say that that cinematic Kanye West sound really became the dominant style of hip hop. So much so that even earlier producers tended to incorporate some of that. Um, Now, that sound it's sort of characterized by the manipulation of samples into a sort of sonic narrative as opposed to a sonic palette. In other words, where Dr. Dre painted a picture with different colors from different elements of funk and jazz and soul, what Kanye did was to try to smash the music together in such a way that the music itself became less important than the sonic linear narrative he was telling with it. And that's something that Ye, as he's currently known, still does with his music, and that definitely became the predominant production style of the early 2000s. Although the music that was made and is made by by Wiz Khalifa is someone that shows that G Funk isn't dead because he kind of revived it. Warren G once called him sort of his spiritual successor in a way. They became good friends, and so Wiz's stuff definitely has that G Funk sound. So G Funk definitely isn't dead. And although Dr. Dre has constantly evolved and embraced his own version of the cinematic sound, like I said, he did some different G Funk things on 2001 than he did on the Chronic and Doggy Style. But his new album, Missionary, that he's just come out with, well, it's a Snoop Dogg album, but Dre has produced the whole thing. It's a collaboration, like a lot of their stuff has been. It definitely has elements of what I would call neo G Funk, heavy with the synth pads, heavily, polyphonic synth harmonies, especially a song called Gorgeous, which has been one of the singles from this album. Definitely shades of G Funk. So G-Funk definitely changed all of music. First of all, it changed hip hop because whether you were doing a hardcore rap album or a neo R&B album, everyone wanted that laid back synth heavy, bass guitar heavy, lead synth solo heavy sound. Whether you were a vocalist in the R&B genre like Mary J. Blige, or whether you were a hardcore rapper, or whether you were kind of somewhere in between, like the kind of Nate Dogg solo albums that you should really check out. It changed all of hip hop. Everyone after a few years wanted to have that G-funk sound, changed R&B, and the 90s was also the era when the hip hop musical idiom started to become more progressive and more interesting than rock. I would argue that after the first 3 or 4 years of the 90s, rock really stagnated, but G-funk really became something that people could, something for you to bounce to quote Warren G. And in turn, by the turn of the 21st century, we see the decline in both popularity and innovation of rock, which from the sort of the mid 60s to the 90s had been the idiom that defined pop music. And now we see hip hop being the musical idiom that defines the rest of pop music. And I think without people like Dre and Warren G and DJ Quick and all of the other greats I mentioned, I don't know if that transformation of pop music would have happened. So history was made. And so that is my take on the G Funk era. Let me know what you think. It's always fun to listen to this music. It's a young channel here. I talk about all different styles of music, from classical to hip hop to jazz to rock to folk to a guy putting a kazoo under his armpit. Not Weird Al. He'd never do something like that. But comedy music I've talked about. So all taste catered for. So do remember to like and subscribe because that helps the channel grow. Share it with your friends and the rest of them. And as always, do take care. We will see you next time. Bye bye, everyone.